Hey guys, tonight we're exploring medieval psychology, the ancient science of confidently guessing what's wrong with you and then bleeding about it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. In medieval psychology, sadness was not an emotion. It was not grief. It was not stress. It was not the perfectly reasonable reaction to living in a damp hut while everyone you know slowly died of preventable causes. No, sadness was a fluid problem. Specifically, it was black bile, a cold, dry, mysterious substance that medieval scholars imagined sloshing around inside you like emotional tar. If you felt gloomy, it wasn't because life was hard. It was because your internal plumbing had failed. According to medieval theory, black bile caused melancholy, despair, brooding, and what doctors politely described as excessive thought. Thinking too much, by the way, was a medical red flag. Medieval psychology looked at introspection and said, absolutely not. That's how bile accumulates. The diagnosis was simple. Are you sad? Then congratulations, you are full of bile. The treatment was even simpler. Remove the bile. How? Bloodletting, vomiting, laxatives, sweating, starving. Occasionally all of them in one exciting afternoon. Medieval medicine responded to emotional exhaustion by saying, what if we also make you physically miserable and see which one wins? Doctors took this very seriously. They watched how often you sighed. They tracked your sleep. They analysed whether you stared into the distance too thoughtfully. A person who quietly reflected was considered more dangerous than someone loudly screaming. Silence meant bile was settling, and grief was treated the same way. If your spouse died, medieval psychology didn't recommend comfort, community, or time. It recommended a bowl, a blade, and a firm belief that emotions should be drained like spoiled wine. Creative people were especially doomed. Poets, artists, scholars, anyone who enjoyed thinking, were considered prime candidates for melancholy. Creativity was tolerated only in small doses. Too much imagination caused bile buildup, which caused sadness, which caused treatment, which often caused death. A very efficient system. And here's the best part. If you survived the treatment, the doctor declared success. If you didn't, the problem was technically resolved. Either way, medieval psychology congratulated itself. In an odd way, turning sadness into a substance made it feel controllable. You couldn't understand your emotions, but you could extract them. You couldn't heal your mind, but you could weaken your body until you stopped complaining. Unfortunately, sadness is not a liquid. Black bile does not exist, and bleeding someone does not cure despair. But medieval psychology didn't know that, and it was extremely confident anyway. After medieval psychology decided sadness was a liquid problem, it made another bold discovery. Thinking is risky behavior, not dangerous in a philosophical sense, dangerous in a your brain might overheat and ruin your life sense. Reflection, analysis, and prolonged thought were all considered health hazards. According to medieval scholars, the brain was delicate, soft, moist, extremely sensitive to vibes. If you thought too much, you generated excess heat. That heat dried the brain. A dried brain led to madness, and madness naturally led to consequences that usually involved chains. So, medieval psychology advised moderation in all intellectual activity. You were encouraged to think just enough to do your job, say your prayers, and not ask follow-up questions. Curiosity was tolerated briefly, then monitored closely. Scholars warned that excessive study, reading late at night, or concentrating too intensely could cause mental collapse. Imagine being told that learning Latin was medically risky. Medieval psychology essentially looked at education and said, careful, that's how it starts. Students were advised to take breaks from thinking, long breaks, ideally permanent ones. Overexerting the mind was believed to drain vital spirits, disturb the humours, and invite melancholy. In other words, Thinking too hard made your bile angry again. Everything always came back to bile. The truly unfortunate were philosophers. Medieval society admired philosophers in theory, but distrusted them in practice. A philosopher who asked too many questions wasn't seen as insightful. He was seen as someone courting insanity. If you stared into space too often, people assumed your brain was overheating and quietly rearranging itself. And then there were women. Medieval psychology believed women were especially vulnerable to thinking-related disorders because their brains were supposedly colder, wetter, and more emotionally reactive. This meant that serious intellectual thought was considered not just inappropriate, but medically irresponsible. Education for women wasn't discouraged because of ideology alone. It was discouraged for their own health. Even dreams were suspicious. Vivid dreams meant the imagination was running unchecked, which implied mental imbalance. If you dreamed too creatively, it meant your mind hadn't shut down properly. Sleep was supposed to be passive. If it wasn't, something was wrong. The safest mental state, according to medieval psychology, was mild awareness paired with obedience. Think a little, feel a little, never too much of either. Modern psychology encourages reflection. Medieval psychology encouraged a nap. And honestly, given the circumstances, that might have been the healthiest advice they accidentally gave. Once medieval psychology decided that thinking too much could cook your brain, it made another important discovery. Anger was not emotional. It was internal combustion. Specifically, it was your liver overheating like a poorly ventilated furnace. According to medieval theory, anger came from an excess of yellow bile, a hot and dry substance produced by the liver. If you were calm, your liver was behaving itself. If you were angry, your liver was throwing a tantrum. Emotional regulation, therefore, was not about self-control. It was about temperature management. This meant rage had nothing to do with frustration, injustice, or the fact that medieval life was objectively awful. No, you were angry because your organs were too warm. The solution was obvious. Cool the body, calm the bile, and tell the liver to stop acting up. Treatments included cold baths, cooling diets, and bloodletting. Because apparently removing blood was medieval medicine's answer to everything. If someone had a temper, doctors might recommend avoiding spicy foods, alcohol, sex, and excitement. In short, avoid everything that made life tolerable. Medieval psychology also believed that chronic anger could physically warp your personality. Angry people were described as sharp, bitter, aggressive, and difficult, which, to be fair, is not entirely wrong. But instead of therapy or conflict resolution, the advice was simple. Reduce heat. Eat cold foods. Sit quietly. Do not argue. Ideally, stop having opinions. Men were believed to be more prone to anger because their bodies were naturally hotter. This conveniently explained violence while excusing it. Women, being colder and wetter, were thought to be less angry, unless their moisture levels went wrong, in which case they became hysterical. Medieval psychology was very proud of how neatly it explained everything while understanding nothing. Even righteous anger was discouraged. Excess passion of any kind was dangerous. A man who shouted too much was not standing up for himself. He was medically unbalanced. A woman who expressed anger at all was, well, that was a separate problem involving prayer. In medieval courts, anger was sometimes treated as evidence of poor health rather than bad behavior. If you lashed out, the assumption wasn't that you were wrong. It was that your liver needed intervention. Accountability was optional. Cooling was mandatory. Modern psychology sees anger as a response to stimuli. Medieval psychology saw it as a temperature issue. If only all emotional problems could be solved with fewer spices and a nice cold bath. After medieval psychology finished blaming sadness on bile and anger on overheated organs, it turned its attention to love, and immediately decided that love was not romantic, poetic, or meaningful. Love was a diagnosable illness, temporary, dangerous, and best handled by someone with a knife and a bowl. This condition was known as love sickness, and medieval scholars treated it with the seriousness usually reserved for plague outbreaks. Falling in love caused paleness, insomnia, loss of appetite, obsessive thinking, sudden poetry writing, and an alarming tendency to stare at nothing while smiling. In other words, medieval psychology accidentally described being in love, and then panicked. Doctors believed love disrupted the balance of the humours, overheating the heart and drying the brain. Too much passion sent vital spirits racing through the body like excited children in a monastery. This was unhealthy. Order had been lost. Fluids were misbehaving again. The symptoms were well documented. A lovesick person might sigh excessively, avoid food, speak in metaphors, and lose interest in practical labour. If a peasant stopped ploughing fields because he was thinking about someone's eyes, this was not considered devotion. It was considered a medical emergency. Treatment varied, but none of it involved happiness. Cold baths were common, because medieval medicine firmly believed that romance could be rinsed away. Bloodletting was also popular, because if you were thinking too much about love, clearly you had too much blood. Dietary changes were recommended as well. Bland foods, no spices, no wine, no excitement, and absolutely no seeing the person you loved. Exposure therapy was not part of the plan. In more severe cases, doctors advised marriage, not as a celebration of love, but as containment. If the object of affection was unavailable, the solution was distraction. Travel, prayer, physical labour, or intense supervision were all prescribed. Feelings were not explored. They were redirected like inconvenient river water. Women diagnosed with love sickness were often treated as emotionally unstable, while men were treated as temporarily foolish. This double standard was not subtle. Medieval psychology rarely was. The most tragic part is that love was only tolerated when it behaved itself. Controlled affection within marriage was acceptable. Passion, longing, obsession, or desire, deeply suspicious. Love was allowed only in small, regulated doses, like a dangerous medicine. Modern psychology sees love as attachment, chemistry, and connection. Medieval psychology saw it as a fever, and like all medieval fevers, the solution was to drain something until the problem stopped moving. At this point, medieval psychology had explained sadness with bile, anger with overheated organs, and love with feverish insanity. Naturally, it then turned to women and said, yes, this is their fault. Scientifically. According to medieval thinkers, women were more emotional not because of social conditions, limited rights, constant childbirth, or the fact that medieval life was relentlessly brutal. No, women were emotional because they were wetter, colder, more moist, psychologically soggy. This theory was taken very seriously. Medieval psychology believed that the ideal human temperament was hot and dry. Dryness meant stability. Heat meant energy. Men, conveniently, were described as naturally hotter and drier, which explained why they were rational, authoritative, and allowed to speak in public without supervision. Women, on the other hand, were believed to be colder and wetter. Moisture, according to medieval science, caused instability. Emotions slipped around. Thoughts didn't set properly. Reason failed to harden. The mind, like damp bread, simply refused to behave. This moisture theory explained everything medieval society already wanted to believe. Emotional expression, moisture, crying, excess moisture escaping, anger, improper fluid distribution, intelligence. Possible, but risky. Too much thinking could overheat the already damp brain, which was obviously a problem. As a result, education for women was considered medically questionable. Intellectual activity might imbalance their humours, dry out their moisture, or, worse, give them opinions. Medieval psychology framed restriction as protection. We're not limiting you, they said. We're preserving your health. Medical texts warned that women needed supervision, moderation, and control to maintain balance. Strong emotions were considered dangerous, not because they were powerful, but because they disrupted the fragile moisture equilibrium. Emotional regulation was not encouraged. Emotional containment was. Even childbirth reinforced these beliefs. The physical processes of pregnancy and menstruation were interpreted as evidence that women were governed by fluids. This made them mysterious, unpredictable, and, therefore, suspicious. Psychology became an excuse for social hierarchy. What medieval scholars never considered was that maybe women were emotional because their lives were constrained, dangerous, and exhausting. That idea would have required thinking, and thinking, as we've established, was dangerous. Modern psychology recognizes emotion as human. Medieval psychology blamed water, and somehow this explanation survived for centuries, proving that confidence, not accuracy, is often the most persuasive force of all. Once medieval psychology finished blaming emotions on fluids, temperature, and dampness, it turned its attention to dreams, and immediately decided that the brain could not possibly be responsible. Dreams were not random, they were not memory fragments, they were not the result of stress, digestion, or that questionable cheese you ate before bed. Dreams were messages. The only question was, messages from whom? According to medieval thinkers, dreams could come from God, angels, demons, the stars, your bodily humours, or your dinner, sometimes all at once. Interpretation was everything. A dream wasn't something you experienced, it was something you needed decoded before it ruined your life. Pleasant dreams were suspicious. Why was your mind so relaxed? What were you forgetting to repent for? Nightmares, on the other hand, were very useful. They could indicate sin, spiritual attack, demonic influence, or internal imbalance. Medieval psychology loved dreams because no matter what happened, it was definitely your fault. Medical texts explained dreams as vapours rising from the stomach to the brain during sleep. If those vapours were heavy, you had dark dreams. If they were light, you had pleasant ones. If they were chaotic, you were ill. This meant digestion was not just important for health, it was shaping your subconscious. Dream interpretation manuals became wildly popular. These books listed symbols and their meanings with impressive confidence. Snakes meant betrayal, fire meant passion or damnation, falling meant moral weakness, teeth falling out meant something bad. It was never good. Dreams were rarely interpreted as neutral. Medieval psychology didn't believe in neutral mental experiences. Monks took dreams especially seriously. A single vivid dream could lead to days of prayer, fasting, and anxiety. Dreams were treated as evidence of temptation, evidence of divine testing, evidence that your mind was not under proper control. Even erotic dreams were considered moral failures, despite happening while unconscious. Medieval psychology managed to invent guilt that operated independently of your awareness. You could sin in your sleep and still be held accountable. Truly impressive. Modern psychology sees dreams as the brain processing information. Medieval psychology saw them as supernatural performance reviews. And like all performance reviews, they were stressful, confusing, and never quite explained what you were supposed to do better next time. After medieval psychology finished blaming your emotions on fluids and your dreams on divine messaging systems, it arrived at one of its boldest conclusions. If your mind was struggling, you had done something wrong. Mental illness was not a condition, it was not a health issue. It was a character flaw with spiritual consequences. If someone behaved erratically, heard voices, withdrew from society, or experienced intense fear, medieval psychology didn't ask what they were experiencing internally. It asked what sin had caused it. Madness was understood as punishment, possession, or weakness of faith. Sometimes all three, if the situation called for enthusiasm. This belief was incredibly convenient. If mental suffering came from moral failure, then society didn't need to offer care, support, or understanding. It needed discipline, correction, prayer, and occasionally restraint. People with mental illness were often encouraged to confess, repent, fast, or pray harder. If that didn't work, the assumption was not that the treatment was ineffective. It was that the person was resisting divine help. responsibility always flowed downward. In more extreme cases, individuals were restrained, isolated, or handed over to religious authorities. Not for cruelty, but for correction. Medieval psychology truly believed that isolation and punishment could bring the mind back into alignment. If someone screamed, it meant the soul was fighting. If someone went silent, it meant the soul was losing. Either outcome was interpreted as progress. There was also a hierarchy of acceptable suffering. Melancholy among scholars was tolerated. Madness among peasants was suspicious. A noble behaving strangely was eccentric. A poor person doing the same thing was dangerous. Psychology adapted beautifully to social class. The most uncomfortable truth is that medieval psychology wasn't trying to be cruel. It was trying to impose order. A world without explanations is terrifying, so medieval thinkers created explanations that preserved authority and moral clarity. Unfortunately, those explanations turned suffering into guilt. Modern psychology recognizes mental illness as complex, biological, psychological, and social. Medieval psychology saw it as disobedience, and once you define illness as sin, the cure stops being compassion and starts being control, which medieval society was very good at. Once medieval psychology decided that mental suffering was a moral issue, it moved on to fear, and immediately concluded that fear was not an emotion, but a mechanical failure. Fear didn't come from danger, uncertainty, or the perfectly reasonable awareness that medieval life was horrifying. Fear came from weak blood flow. According to medieval thinkers, courage was the result of warm, fast-moving blood circulating bravely through the body. Fear happened when blood cooled, slowed, or retreated inward, like it had lost confidence. A frightened person wasn't cautious, they were poorly circulated. This explained everything medieval society already believed. Brave men were hot-blooded, cowards were cold, literally. Fear caused the heart to shrink, the limbs to tremble, and the face to pale, all signs that the vital spirits were fleeing the battlefield. Medieval psychology saw fear and said, "Ah yes, your blood has abandoned you." Treatment followed predictable logic. To cure fear, you had to warm the body and stimulate circulation. This meant hot foods, wine, spices, physical exertion, and, occasionally, yelling at the frightened person until they improved. If you were afraid, you weren't offered reassurance. You were encouraged to toughen up metabolically. Soldiers who panicked in battle were not considered traumatized. They were defective. Their blood was weak. Their hearts were cold. Fear was not a survival instinct. It was a personal failure with biological implications. Women, naturally, were considered more fearful because they were colder by nature. Children were fearful because their bodies were still forming. Elderly people were fearful because their heat was fading. In every case, fear was framed as physical decline rather than emotional response. What medieval psychology never considered was that fear is often intelligent. Fear keeps you alive. Fear tells you when something is dangerous. Fear is information. But acknowledging that would have required admitting that panic in a plague-ridden city might be reasonable. And medieval psychology did not reward reason. Even nightmares were linked to fear's physicality. If you woke trembling, it meant your blood had cooled too much during sleep. The solution wasn't comfort. It was warmth. More blankets. More food. Less thinking. Always less thinking. Modern psychology treats fear as a protective response. Medieval psychology treated it as a circulation problem. And honestly, given the lack of safety equipment, maybe fear was the healthiest instinct people had, even if medieval science spent centuries trying to beat it out of them. After medieval psychology blamed your emotions on fluids, temperature, morality, and blood flow, it reached what it considered the final, irrefutable explanation. The planets did it. According to medieval belief, your personality, emotions, and mental stability were heavily influenced by the position of celestial bodies at the moment you were born. Not metaphorically, literally. Mars didn't just symbolize anger, it installed it. Saturn didn't suggest melancholy. It personally delivered it, signed, sealed, and guaranteed. This meant your mind wasn't fully yours. It was leased. Astrology was not fringe thinking. It was mainstream psychology. Scholars, physicians, and clergy all agreed that the heavens shaped human thought the way the moon shaped the tides, except with more paperwork and fewer refunds. If you were anxious, Mercury was acting up. If you were aggressive, Mars was nearby. If you were sad, Saturn had parked itself in the wrong house. And if your life was falling apart entirely, congratulations, you were born at an inconvenient time. Birth charts were treated like psychological profiles. Doctors consulted them before making diagnoses. Kings consulted them before making decisions. Parents consulted them to explain why one child was calm and the other one was like that. The beauty of astrology was that it explained everything while absolving everyone. Your temper wasn't your fault. Your sadness wasn't your fault. Your terrible decision-making wasn't your fault. It was written in the stars. Accountability floated somewhere between Jupiter and nowhere. Even treatment depended on astrology. Certain days were considered better for bloodletting, purging, or emotional correction. Performing a medical procedure under the wrong planetary alignment could make things worse, which was impressive, considering how bad things already were. Medieval psychology also believed planetary influence could wax and wane. You might be emotionally stable one month and unhinged the next, simply because Venus had moved. This made self-reflection unnecessary. Why improve yourself when the universe might fix it next Tuesday? Modern psychology studies patterns, biology, and environment. Medieval psychology studied the sky and said, yes, that explains your personality. And while astrology today is mostly used for entertainment, medieval society used it as therapy, diagnosis, and excuse generator. If nothing else, it was comforting. Your problems weren't random. They were cosmically scheduled. After medieval psychology outsourced your personality to the planets, it decided to take a look inside the human head, without actually opening it, of course, and announced another breakthrough. The brain is a building. A very small, very damp building with designated rooms for thinking. According to medieval scholars, the brain was divided into compartments, or cells, each responsible for a different mental function. Memory lived in one chamber. Imagination lived in another. Reason occupied the front, because obviously reason wanted a window. If one room malfunctioned, that explained everything. This model was taken extremely seriously. If you forgot things, your memory chamber was weak. If you hallucinated, your imagination room was unsupervised. If you made bad decisions, your reason chamber was poorly furnished. Mental illness was now an interior design issue. Medical texts described these chambers in impressive detail, despite no one having actually seen them. The front of the brain handled reasoning, the middle dealt with imagination, and the back stored memory, which explained why head injuries were terrifying. A blow to the wrong spot didn't just hurt, it redecorated your mind. And yes, medieval psychology believed these chambers could be physically affected by diet, emotions, and weather. Cold air made the brain too moist. Heat dried it out. Excess thinking overheated specific rooms. The brain, in medieval theory, was basically a medieval house with terrible insulation and constant mold problems. This belief shaped treatment. To improve memory, doctors recommended strengthening the memory chamber with herbs, prayers, repetition, and sometimes strong smells, because nothing sharpens recall like being assaulted by incense. If imagination ran wild, patients were advised to reduce stimulation, avoid stories, and stop thinking creatively, which medieval psychology considered a perfectly reasonable request. Education was also shaped by this model. Learning too much too fast was dangerous. You might overload a chamber. Better to memorize slowly, cautiously, and under supervision. A mind bursting with knowledge was not impressive. It was structurally unsound. Modern neuroscience maps networks and processes. Medieval psychology drew floor plans. And while the idea of mental rooms sounds ridiculous now, it gave medieval thinkers a sense of control. If the mind had structure, it could be managed. If it could be managed, it could be corrected, even if the blueprint was completely imaginary. After medieval psychology carefully explained where your memories were stored and which room imagination was misbehaving in, it turned its suspicious gaze toward happiness and immediately decided that too much joy was a medical risk. Yes, being happy was fine. Being very happy, deeply concerning. According to medieval thinkers, intense joy overheated the heart, and an overheated heart was dangerous. The heart, remember, was not just a pump. It was the emotional command center. If joy became excessive, the heart expanded, spirits rushed, balance collapsed, and sudden death politely showed up uninvited. This meant medieval psychology genuinely warned people against excitement. Sudden good news was risky. Laughter needed moderation. Celebration required restraint. If someone experienced overwhelming happiness, doctors advised calm, rest, and emotional cooling, because joy, left unchecked, could kill you faster than sadness ever did. And medieval texts were full of examples meant to terrify readers into emotional moderation. Stories of people who laughed themselves to death, people who collapsed from excitement, people who received wonderful news and immediately expired. Whether these stories were exaggerated, misunderstood, or completely fictional did not matter. They were cited confidently, and confidence was medieval psychology's strongest instrument. Even love-related happiness was dangerous. Too much delight in romance could weaken the body. Passion stirred spirits too aggressively. A joyful heart was a reckless heart. The safest emotional state, according to medieval wisdom, was calm contentment with a light sprinkle of concern. This belief made emotional restraint virtuous. A composed person was healthy. A visibly joyful person was suspicious. Someone laughing loudly in public was either drunk, sinful, or moments away from collapse. Monastic life reinforced this idea. Excess emotion, joy included, disrupted spiritual focus. Smiling too much could indicate pride. Laughter might invite temptation. Medieval psychology quietly suggested that serenity was the only safe emotional speed. Modern psychology encourages joy, connection, and emotional expression. Medieval psychology encouraged emotional cruise control. And in a world where happiness could be taken away at any moment by disease, famine, or war, perhaps distrusting joy felt logical. If you never let yourself feel too happy, you never risked losing it. It wasn't optimism. It was emotional risk management. And medieval psychology was very, very risk-averse, especially when it came to smiling too hard. After medieval psychology decided that too much happiness could kill you, it turned its attention to children and made another confident conclusion. Children were not fully human yet, not metaphorically, literally incomplete, like unfinished furniture that hadn't set properly. Medieval thinkers believed children were governed almost entirely by moisture. Their bodies were soft, wet, and unstable. Their minds were even worse. A child's brain, according to medieval psychology, had not hardened enough to support proper reason. This explained everything from tantrums to curiosity, to the fact that children asked inconvenient questions. Children weren't seen as developing psychologically. They were seen as lacking structure. Their thoughts slipped. Their emotions overflowed. Their attention wandered. None of this was considered normal development. It was considered evidence of deficiency. As a result, emotional expression in children wasn't explored or nurtured. It was corrected. Loud laughter, excess spirits, crying, weak control, fear, cold blood, curiosity, dangerous thinking. Childhood was not a stage to be understood. It was a condition to be managed. Education reflected this belief. Learning was heavily focused on memorization and obedience. Imagination was discouraged because it strengthened the wrong brain chamber. Too much play was wasteful. Too much questioning was suspicious. A good child was quiet, compliant, and emotionally restrained, essentially a small adult with worse coordination. Discipline was harsh, not because medieval parents were uniquely cruel, but because psychology supported it. If children were unstable, then firmness created structure. Pain was instructional. Fear was corrective. Affection was optional. Even affection itself was treated cautiously. Too much warmth might spoil a child's temperament. Too much comfort might prevent the humours from settling properly. Medieval psychology believed resilience came from restraint, not support. And because children were seen as unfinished, their emotions were rarely taken seriously. A child in distress wasn't anxious or overwhelmed. They were misaligned. The solution was correction, not conversation. Modern psychology sees childhood as foundational. Medieval psychology saw it as a problem to survive. Children weren't encouraged to grow emotionally. They were expected to harden. And in a world that demanded endurance above all else, medieval psychology believed it was doing them a favour, even if it never once asked how the children felt about it. After medieval psychology decided children needed hardening rather than nurturing, it turned to adults and announced another solution to mental distress: stop talking. Silence, according to medieval thinkers, was not just polite, it was therapeutic. Words stirred the mind. Thoughts followed words, emotions followed thoughts. And emotions, as we've established, were dangerous, damp, overheated, morally suspicious, and probably full of bile. Therefore, silence was medicine. Monastic psychology perfected this idea. Monks believed that speech scattered the mind, while silence gathered it back into order. Talking too much weakened reason. Joking was risky. Complaining was spiritually corrosive. Silence allowed thoughts to settle, humours to calm, and the soul to stop doing whatever it had been doing wrong. Even outside monasteries, medieval psychology encouraged restrained speech. A quiet person was considered wise. A talkative person was considered unstable. Someone who spoke passionately or emotionally was not expressive. They were imbalanced. Excess words meant excess thought, and excess thought led directly back to madness. Silence was especially recommended for people experiencing distress. Feeling anxious? Be silent. Feeling sad? Be silent. Feeling angry? Definitely be silent. Medieval psychology believed that speaking about emotions amplified them, much like blowing on a fire. Suppressing thoughts wasn't repression, it was maintenance. This belief also made silence a moral virtue. Quiet people were disciplined, loud people were suspect. Speaking out, especially against authority, wasn't framed as dissent, it was framed as psychological instability. If you objected too strongly, perhaps your humours were acting up. Women were encouraged towards silence more than men. Emotional speech was seen as proof of instability, and silence was framed as protection. Medieval psychology didn't silence people by accident. It medicalized silence. And to be fair, silence sometimes helped. In a chaotic, noisy world, quiet moments probably did calm the mind. But medieval psychology didn't stop there. It didn't recommend balance. It recommended suppression. Modern psychology encourages expression, reflection, and communication. Medieval psychology encouraged quiet obedience. Silence wasn't about understanding yourself, it was about containing yourself. And in a society obsessed with order, silence was the most efficient mental health tool they had, even if it solved nothing and taught people to suffer quietly. After medieval psychology explained emotions with fluids, fear with circulation, joy with heart explosions, and silence as therapy, it arrived at its grand unifying theory. The mind did not exist on its own. There was no such thing as mental health. There was only spiritual alignment. Thoughts, emotions, behaviours, all of it was inseparable from the soul. If your mind struggled, it meant your soul was out of order. If your emotions overflowed, your soul lacked discipline. If you felt despair, confusion, or anxiety, medieval psychology didn't ask what happened to you. It asked what you had failed to do. This made psychological suffering incredibly easy to explain, and incredibly hard to escape. If the mind was simply a reflection of spiritual health, then the solution was not understanding, support, or care. The solution was obedience, prayer, repentance, moral correction. Mental distress was treated the same way moral failure was treated, with instruction and control. This belief wrapped every psychological concept we've discussed into one airtight system. Sadness wasn't an emotion, it was spiritual imbalance. Anger wasn't frustration, it was moral heat. Fear wasn't instinct, it was weakness of faith. Joy wasn't relief, it was spiritual risk. And because the soul was eternal, suffering was often framed as purposeful. Endurance built virtue, struggle refined character. Mental pain was not something to remove, it was something to survive quietly and learn from. In a strange way, this worldview gave meaning to suffering. If pain had purpose, then it wasn't random, it wasn't meaningless. But it also meant that asking for help was dangerous. Seeking relief could be interpreted as avoiding spiritual growth. Authority benefited enormously from this belief. If distress was spiritual, then priests, not patients, held the answers. Obedience became therapy. Submission became healing. And questioning the system wasn't curiosity, it was rebellion. Modern psychology separates mind, body, and belief, while recognizing their interaction. Medieval psychology fused them into one moral equation. And while that system helped medieval society maintain order, it did so by misunderstanding the mind entirely. The medieval world didn't lack intelligence. It lacked tools. So it built explanations out of what it had: faith, tradition, fear, and confidence. And it believed them completely, which may be the most human psychological trait of all. If there's one psychological principle medieval thinkers truly mastered, even if by accident, it's this: confidence beats correctness every time. Medieval popular psychology worked not because it was accurate, but because it was delivered with absolute certainty. There were no maybes, no "we're still studying this," no "results may vary." Every explanation arrived fully formed, confident, and unwilling to be questioned. Sad, black bile, angry, hot liver, confused, planetary interference, dreamed something weird, spiritual issue, struggling mentally, moral failure, no ambiguity, no uncertainty, just answers, and people loved that. In a world filled with famine, disease, war, and death, certainty was comforting. Not knowing why something happened was terrifying. So, medieval psychology didn't leave space for doubt. It filled every gap with explanation, even if the explanation was nonsense. Especially if it was nonsense, because nonsense can't be disproven easily. These ideas spread because they were simple, repeatable, and authoritative. Anyone could learn them. Anyone could apply them. You didn't need training, research, or evidence. You needed confidence and a straight face. And once an idea was accepted, it became self-reinforcing. If a treatment worked, it proved the theory. If it failed, the patient was at fault. If someone recovered, the system took credit. If someone didn't, the system explained why they deserved it. That's not bad science. That's excellent propaganda. Medieval psychology also benefited from hierarchy. Knowledge flowed downward. Scholars spoke. Everyone else listened. Questioning wasn't curiosity. It was instability. Doubt itself became a symptom. And here's the uncomfortable part. This isn't just medieval. Modern people like to think we're immune to confident nonsense. We are not. We still gravitate towards simple explanations, neat labels, and theories that tell us who's at fault. We still prefer certainty over complexity. We still confuse confidence with truth. The medieval world didn't fail because it was stupid. It failed because it was human. Given limited tools, limited data, and overwhelming fear, people created explanations that felt right and defended them fiercely. Psychology wasn't about understanding minds. It was about maintaining order, reducing uncertainty, and making suffering feel explainable. So when we laugh at medieval psychology, we're not just mocking the past, we're seeing a version of ourselves, just with worse hygiene and stronger opinions. And that might be the most psychologically accurate conclusion medieval science never meant to reach. In the 3rd century before Christ, the Adriatic Sea was not a peaceful stretch of blue water connecting friendly ports. It was a contested highway of warships, merchant convoys, and coastal strongholds, where power belonged to whoever could control the waves. Along its eastern shore lay Illyria, a rugged land of mountains, islands, and fiercely independent tribes whose strength came not from vast armies, but from the sea itself. It was into this maritime world that Teuta of Illyria rose to power. Teuta did not inherit a quiet throne. She became regent after the sudden death of King Agron, ruling on behalf of his young son Pinnes. To outsiders, especially the Greek city-states and the rising Roman Republic, this arrangement looked fragile. A woman in command, governing a warrior society known for raiding and seafaring, seemed unlikely to last. Yet those assumptions revealed more about foreign prejudice than Illyrian reality. Illyrian society was accustomed to strong leaders who proved themselves through action, rather than lineage alone. Teuta understood this instinctively. Instead of softening Agron's policies or retreating into diplomacy, she embraced the foundations of Illyrian power: ships, sailors, and dominance of the Adriatic coast. Under her regency, Illyria did not pause or hesitate. It expanded. The Illyrian navy grew more organized and more aggressive. Fast, light vessels patrolled the coastline and island chains, striking merchant ships and enemy ports with precision. To the Illyrians, these actions were not criminal piracy, but an accepted extension of maritime warfare. Control of the sea meant survival, wealth, and leverage. Teuta defended this worldview fiercely, refusing to distinguish between raiding and rule. From her coastal strongholds, Teuta governed not as a ceremonial figure, but as a naval commander. She delegated authority to trusted captains, fortified ports, and encouraged the continuation of seaborne raids that filled Illyrian coffers and kept rival powers uneasy. Her rule signalled continuity, not weakness. What truly unsettled her neighbours was not just the raids, but the confidence behind them. Teuta acted like a sovereign who expected obedience, not permission. She ruled as if the Adriatic already belonged to her, and in many ways it did. For a brief but decisive moment, Illyria was no longer reacting to larger powers. Under Teuta, it was challenging them directly, ship by ship, wave by wave. Teuta's power rested on a principle that terrified her neighbours and unified her people. The sea obeyed Illyrian law, not foreign complaints. Along the Adriatic coast, generations of Illyrians had lived by maritime raiding. Ships were tools of survival, and taking cargo from passing merchants was considered no different from taxing land routes or seizing enemy livestock. When Teuta assumed regency, she did not attempt to reform this tradition. She formalized it. Rather than treating raids as uncontrolled acts of banditry, Teuta allowed local commanders wide autonomy at sea. Captains operated under the understanding that success brought reward, failure brought punishment, and loyalty to the crown was non-negotiable. This system created a ruthless but effective naval culture. Illyrian ships became faster, bolder, and more coordinated. Coastal cities that resisted were harassed. Those that cooperated were left untouched. To Greek merchants and Roman traders, this distinction meant little. Their ships were still boarded, their crews threatened, and their cargoes seized. Complaints began to flood diplomatic channels, especially from Rome, which was just beginning to look eastward across the Adriatic. Roman senators labelled these actions piracy, a word loaded with moral outrage and political justification. Teuta rejected the label entirely. When Roman envoys arrived to demand restraint, they expected negotiation. What they encountered instead was a ruler who spoke from a position of strength. Teuta reportedly argued that Illyrian custom did not forbid private citizens from taking wealth at sea. The state was not responsible for the actions of individual sailors. To Rome, this sounded like arrogance. To Illyria, it was a declaration of sovereignty. This moment marked a fundamental clash of worldviews. Rome believed law flowed from centralized authority. Teuta ruled a kingdom where power flowed outward, delegated to warriors who earned their keep through conquest. Neither side misunderstood the other. They simply refused to yield. By defending Illyrian maritime customs, Teuta was not provoking war out of recklessness. She was preserving the economic backbone of her realm. To restrict naval raids would weaken her captains, her treasury, and her legitimacy. Authority in Illyria depended on visible strength, especially from a female ruler navigating a violent political landscape. What Rome saw as lawlessness, Teuta saw as order. And as Roman patience thinned, the Adriatic began to feel less like a shared sea and more like a fault line, one that would soon fracture into open war. For years, Rome had tolerated instability beyond the Adriatic with irritation rather than urgency. Illyria was distant, fragmented, and useful mainly as a source of timber, slaves, and trade routes. But under Teuta of Illyria, Illyrian activity at sea stopped being an inconvenience and became an embarrassment. Roman merchants were attacked with increasing boldness, and worse still, Rome's authority was being openly dismissed. The breaking point came when Roman envoys were sent across the Adriatic to confront the Illyrian court. Diplomacy was meant to reassert Roman superiority without bloodshed. Instead, it exposed just how little Teuta feared Roman threats. She refused to curb Illyrian naval practices and allegedly allowed violence against one of the ambassadors on the return journey. Whether ordered directly or merely tolerated, the message was unmistakable. Illyria did not bow. In Roman political culture, such an insult could not go unanswered. Rome was still shaping its identity as a Mediterranean power, and prestige mattered as much as territory. To allow a foreign queen to challenge Roman authority at sea would signal weakness, not just to Illyria, but to every coastal state watching closely. The Senate responded decisively. What began as a dispute over piracy was reframed as a moral crusade. Rome declared that it was not conquering, but restoring order. The First Roman-Illyrian War was justified as a necessary intervention against chaos, even though Rome had little experience with large-scale naval campaigns in the Adriatic. For Teuta, Rome's declaration of war was not unexpected. She had ruled long enough to know that power invites confrontation. Yet Illyria was not defenseless. Its coastline was dotted with fortified cities, its sailors experienced in fast strikes and retreats, and its knowledge of local waters unmatched. The Adriatic was still Illyrian territory, at least for now. However, Rome brought something Illyria lacked: overwhelming resources and relentless organization. Roman fleets crossed the sea with clear objectives, targeting coastal strongholds one by one. Cities that had once relied on Illyrian protection began to waver, calculating survival over loyalty. The war marked a turning point. For the first time, Teuta faced an enemy that could not be intimidated by reputation alone. The Adriatic was no longer just a battlefield of ships and raids. It had become the front line of a struggle between two visions of power, and only one of them would ultimately dominate the sea. When Roman fleets began appearing along the Adriatic shoreline, the war ceased to be an abstract threat and became a daily reality. Ports that once thrived on Illyrian protection now faced a brutal choice: resist Rome and risk destruction, or defect and survive. For Teuta of Illyria, this was the most dangerous phase of her rule, because naval power alone could not guarantee loyalty on land. Rome advanced methodically. Instead of chasing Illyrian raiders at sea, Roman commanders targeted coastal cities, cutting away the infrastructure that supported Teuta's fleet. One by one, strongholds fell or surrendered. Some cities were taken by force, others opened their gates without a fight, hoping Roman protection would be more predictable than Illyrian dominance. Teuta responded in the way Illyrian rulers always had, by relying on speed, intimidation, and geography. Her ships continued to strike Roman supply lines, harassing fleets and disrupting communications. Narrow channels, rocky shores, and hidden harbours favoured Illyrian sailors, who knew every inlet and current. Roman ships, heavier and less agile, struggled in these unfamiliar waters. Yet this advantage could not offset Rome's persistence. Where Illyrian warfare emphasized swift blows, Roman warfare emphasized endurance. Losses were replaced quickly, fleets were repaired, troops returned in greater numbers. Each Roman victory, however small, chipped away at Tutor's authority. The psychological impact was just as severe. Illyrian commanders, who had once acted independently, now faced an enemy that punished hesitation and rewarded betrayal. Some local leaders abandoned Tutor, negotiating their own terms with Rome. Each defection weakened the illusion of unity that had sustained Illyrian power. As pressure mounted, Tutor withdrew from the most exposed coastal positions, retreating inland and relying on fortified centres farther from Roman reach. This strategic pullback preserved her personal safety, but signalled a loss of control over the sea. The Adriatic, once ruled by Illyrian ships, was slowly slipping from her grasp. The war revealed a harsh truth. Tutor had mastered Illyrian traditions of power, but Rome was fighting a different kind of war, one built on discipline, logistics, and long-term occupation. The clash was no longer about piracy or pride. It was about survival, and Illyria was being forced into a defensive posture it had never truly known. As Roman pressure intensified, the war reached its decisive phase. Illyria could still wound Rome, but it could no longer stop it. The steady fall of coastal cities cut off Tutor's access to the sea, strangling the very source of her authority. Without ports, fleets became liabilities. Ships needed harbours, supplies, and safe passage. Rome understood this and pressed its advantage relentlessly. Facing the collapse of her maritime network, Tutor made a strategic choice rooted in survival rather than pride. She entered negotiations with Rome, not as a defeated pirate queen, but as a ruler seeking to preserve what remained of her kingdom. The resulting settlement was harsh. Illyria was forced to pay tribute, surrender control of much of its coastline, and limit its naval operations. Illyrian ships were forbidden from sailing south of a defined boundary without Roman permission. The Adriatic, once her domain, was now regulated by Roman law. Most striking of all was Tutor's removal from power. Whether she formally abdicated or was politically sidelined, her reign effectively ended with the war. Rome installed client rulers more willing to comply with its demands, ensuring Illyria would never again challenge Roman shipping with the same confidence. Yet defeat did not erase Tutor's legacy. Rome had won militarily, but it had not silenced the message of her rule. For the first time, Rome had fought a war triggered not by conquest alone, but by resistance to a female sovereign who refused to be intimidated. Roman historians later portrayed her as reckless and arrogant, framing the conflict as a necessary lesson in order. But beneath that narrative lay an uncomfortable truth. Tutor had forced Rome to take Illyria seriously. Even in loss, she reshaped the balance of power. The war marked Rome's first major intervention east of the Adriatic, opening the path for future expansion into the Balkans and Greece. Illyria became a testing ground for Roman imperial policy, a place where Rome learned how to dominate maritime regions through control rather than annihilation. Tutor disappeared from the historical record after her fall, but her shadow lingered. She had ruled at the edge of empire and refused to retreat quietly. Though stripped of her fleet and crown, she left behind a warning etched into Roman memory. The sea was never truly tamed, and those who challenged it could force even Rome to act. With Tutor removed from power, Rome did what it always did after victory. It seized control not only of territory, but of the narrative. Roman historians, senators, and later chroniclers framed the First Roman-Illyrian War as a civilizing mission. Illyria was portrayed as lawless, its sailors as pirates, and its queen as an unstable ruler who needed to be put in her place. This version of events would dominate surviving sources for centuries. In Roman accounts, Tutor of Illyria appears less as a sovereign and more as a cautionary tale. She is described as arrogant, impulsive, and incapable of governing responsibly. Her defense of Illyrian maritime customs was twisted into evidence of moral failure. By reducing her rule to personality flaws, Rome avoided acknowledging the legitimacy of Illyrian power or the effectiveness of her leadership. What these sources rarely admit is how seriously Rome took her. The Senate did not mobilize fleets and legions against figures it considered insignificant. Rome crossed the Adriatic because Teuto's policies disrupted trade, challenged authority, and exposed Roman vulnerability at sea. In practical terms, she forced Rome to adapt, to build stronger naval presence, and to rethink how it managed maritime frontiers. The rewriting of her image served a political purpose. By casting Teuta as reckless, Rome justified future interventions. Any resistance could now be labelled piracy. Any defiance could be framed as chaos requiring Roman order. Illyria became an example, a warning to other coastal powers that independence would be punished and remembered unfavourably, yet the very hostility of Roman writing preserves Teuta's importance. If she had been weak, she would have been ignored. Instead, she became a symbol of disorder precisely because she had disrupted Rome's sense of control. Her gender amplified this reaction. A woman exercising naval authority unsettled Roman expectations, making it easier to reduce her to caricature rather than confront the implications of her rule. Outside Roman texts, Illyrian voices are almost entirely lost. What remains must be read between the lines of hostile sources. There, a different figure emerges. A regent who protected her kingdom's economy, enforced tradition, and ruled decisively in a brutal geopolitical environment. Rome may have written the surviving history, but it did not erase Teuta's impact. Even in distortion, her presence endures, etched into Roman memory as a ruler strong enough to demand explanation, condemnation, and justification long after her fall. Stripped of her throne and written into history by her enemies, Teuta might have faded into obscurity. Instead, her story endured precisely because it defied expectations. In a Mediterranean world dominated by male generals and kings, Teuta of Illyria stood out as a ruler whose authority rested on the sea, not on dynastic ceremony or domestic influence. Naval power in the ancient world was rare and difficult to maintain. It required skilled sailors, constant resources, and intimate knowledge of coastal geography. Teuta commanded all three. Her leadership was not symbolic. She governed fleets, directed campaigns, and enforced maritime policy across a fractured coastline. Few rulers of her era, male or female, exercised such direct control over naval warfare. What made Teuta exceptional was not simply that she ruled, but how she ruled. She did not attempt to adopt foreign customs or soften Illyrian traditions to appease outsiders. Instead, she leaned into local values of autonomy, strength, and seaborne dominance. Her authority flowed from action, not rhetoric. Captains followed her because she protected their way of life and rewarded success. Her gender, however, ensured that her rule would be judged differently. Ancient historians struggle to reconcile a woman wielding military authority without framing it as excess or failure. Where male rulers were described as ambitious, Teuta was labelled reckless. Where men were strategic, she was portrayed as emotional. These distortions reveal more about Roman anxieties than Illyrian reality. Yet even within hostile accounts, Teuta's competence is impossible to erase. Rome did not face a disorganized band of raiders, but a coordinated maritime power capable of disrupting trade across an entire sea. The war against Illyria was Rome's first step into sustained naval dominance in the eastern Adriatic, and it was Teuta who forced that step. Beyond military history, her reign challenges modern assumptions about ancient leadership. Illyrian society, often dismissed as peripheral, produced a ruler capable of standing against the largest republic of the age. Teuta's authority suggests that power structures in the ancient Balkans were more flexible and pragmatic than later narratives admit. She ruled briefly but decisively. She lost, but not insignificantly. Teuta did not merely resist Rome. She reshaped the geopolitical map that Rome would later dominate. In doing so, she secured a place not as a footnote, but as one of the ancient world's most formidable maritime sovereigns. Teuta's removal from power did not end Illyrian resistance, but it permanently altered its character. After the First Roman-Illyrian War, the Adriatic was no longer a contested frontier governed by local customs. It became a monitored sea, watched, regulated, and increasingly dominated by Rome. The treaties imposed after Tutor's defeat were designed not just to punish, but to prevent any future ruler from rebuilding what she had created. Illyrian ships were restricted in number and movement. Ports that once acted independently were bound to Roman interests through client rulers and garrisons. Trade routes shifted westward, favouring Roman merchants who now sailed with greater security. In practical terms, Rome achieved what it had wanted from the beginning: predictable control of maritime commerce. Yet this control came at a cost. Rome had learned that the Adriatic was not naturally submissive. It required constant attention, patrols, and intervention. Rebellions flared repeatedly in the decades that followed, proving that Illyrian seafaring culture could be suppressed, but not erased. Tutor's War had revealed the region's volatility, forcing Rome into a long-term commitment it had not originally planned. For Illyria, the post-Tutor era was one of fragmentation. Without a unifying naval authority, local leaders competed for favour and survival. Some collaborated openly with Rome. Others resisted quietly, waiting for opportunities that rarely came. The age of Illyrian dominance at sea was over, replaced by cautious coexistence under Roman oversight. Ironically, Tutor's defeat accelerated Rome's transformation into a true Mediterranean power. The war pushed Rome to expand its naval capabilities, refine its maritime strategy, and project authority beyond Italy. What began as a response to Illyrian raids became a rehearsal for later conflicts against Carthage, Greece, and the Hellenistic kingdoms. Thus, Tutor's impact outlived her reign. She did not merely lose a war. She forced Rome to grow, adapt, and commit to imperial expansion across the sea. The Adriatic that followed her was quieter, more regulated, but also more Roman. In this way, Tutor shaped the future even in absence. The sea she once ruled no longer answered to Illyrian captains, but it still bore the imprint of the queen who had made Rome cross it in force for the first time. History remembers victors more kindly than challengers, yet some figures endure precisely because they resisted overwhelming power. Tutor belongs to this rare category. Though defeated and displaced, she remains one of the earliest recorded female rulers to command naval warfare on a regional scale. Her story survives not because Rome wanted it to, but because it could not be ignored. Tutor's legacy is not one of conquest, but of defiance. She ruled at a moment when Illyria stood at the edge of history, about to be absorbed into a larger imperial system. Instead of yielding quietly, she asserted sovereignty in the only language that mattered along the Adriatic: control of the sea. Modern interpretations have begun to peel back Roman bias, revealing a ruler acting rationally within her cultural and political context. She defended economic lifelines, upheld tradition, and governed with authority during a volatile regency. That her methods conflicted with Roman ideals does not diminish their effectiveness. It explains Rome's hostility. For the Balkans and the broader Adriatic world, Tutor represents an alternative path that history did not take. A maritime power rooted in local control rather than empire. A queen who ruled not through diplomacy alone, but through ships, sailors, and strategy. Her silence in the historical record after defeat is telling. Rome removed her, but it could not replace the memory of what she represented. Every Roman patrol that crossed the Adriatic afterward was, in some sense, an acknowledgement of her challenge. Tutor did not build an empire. She did something rarer. She stood against one at the moment it was still vulnerable. And though Rome ultimately prevailed, the fact that it had to fight, explain, and rewrite her story ensures that her legacy remains, unsilenced by time or conquest. In 1800, the United States woke up much larger than it had gone to sleep. With the Louisiana Purchase, President Thomas Jefferson had acquired a vast interior stretching west toward lands no American leader had ever seen firsthand. On paper, it was a triumph. In reality, it was a gamble. Maps were vague, borders uncertain, and the terrain beyond the Mississippi was still shaped more by rumour than fact. Jefferson now owned a continent he barely understood. For Jefferson, this was not just a geographic problem, but a political one. European powers still hovered nearby, native nations controlled most of the land, and trade routes were uncharted. If the United States hoped to survive as more than a coastal republic, it needed knowledge. Rivers had to be traced, mountains had to be crossed, alliances had to be formed before rivals could exploit the vacuum. Jefferson's solution was an expedition unlike anything the young nation had attempted. It would be scientific, diplomatic, and military all at once. At its head he placed Meriwether Lewis, a trusted aide with an unusual mix of skills. Lewis was not merely an officer. He studied astronomy to fix positions, botany to catalogue new species, and medicine to keep men alive far from help. Jefferson personally tutored him, ensuring the mission reflected Enlightenment ideals as much as national ambition. Lewis knew he could not do this alone. He chose William Clark, a seasoned frontiersman and soldier with deep experience in wilderness travel and leadership. Though officially ranked below Lewis, Clark functioned as an equal partner, commanding respect through competence rather than title. Together, they embodied Jefferson's vision, reason paired with endurance. The mission's goals were deceptively simple. Find a route to the Pacific, chart rivers and terrain, establish American presence among native nations. But beneath these objectives lay something more urgent. If the expedition failed, the West would remain mysterious and vulnerable. If it succeeded, the United States would claim not just land, but destiny. As Lewis and Clark prepared to depart, they carried more than supplies and instruments. They carried the weight of a nation's expectations. Jefferson was betting that knowledge could secure power, that curiosity could outrun empire. The expedition would soon test whether ideals could survive mountains, rivers, and the unknown. In the spring of 1804, the expedition finally moved. From the last edge of familiar American settlement, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark led a small force officially known as the Corps of Discovery up the Missouri River. It was not a dramatic charge into wilderness, but a slow, grinding push against the current, mile after exhausting mile. Every stroke of the oar carried them farther from certainty and closer to the unknown. The Missouri was both a guide and an enemy. Its waters twisted unpredictably, clogged with snags, shifting sandbars and powerful currents that punished any lapse in attention. Progress was measured in effort rather than distance. Men strained on tow ropes along muddy banks, hauling boats inch by inch while insects swarmed and the sun burned. There was no road to follow, no clear sense of how long the river would continue westward. Despite the hardship, discipline held. Lewis and Clark enforced routine with near-military precision. Watches were kept, journals written, specimens collected. Jefferson's instructions echoed constantly in Lewis's mind. This was not merely a journey. It was an experiment in observation. Plants were pressed, animals described, and landscapes sketched, even when exhaustion tempted the men to collapse without record. The expedition also entered a human frontier. Along the river lived native nations who had watched Europeans and Americans appear, disappear, and return with shifting intentions. Some encounters were cautious but cordial. Others were tense, shaped by rumours of American expansion and past betrayals by foreign traders. Lewis and Clark distributed peace medals bearing Jefferson's image, symbols of a distant authority few truly understood. Beneath the surface of cooperation lay uncertainty. The Corps depended on native goodwill for information, food, and guidance. Yet every alliance carried risk. Misunderstandings could turn fatal. Trust had to be earned daily, gesture by gesture, word by word. Disease, injury, and isolation tested morale. Yet remarkably, no man died in the early months. This was not luck alone. Lewis's medical training and Clark's practical leadership kept the expedition functioning where lesser parties might have collapsed. As the Missouri stretched endlessly ahead, one truth became clear. The river would not simply lead them west. It would strip away illusions. The further they travelled, the more the expedition ceased to be a planned mission and became a test of endurance, adaptability, and trust in one another. As the expedition pushed deeper into the continent, it became increasingly clear that maps and instruments alone would not be enough. The Missouri River could guide them only so far. Beyond that lay mountains no American had crossed from the east, climates few understood, and native nations whose languages and customs were unfamiliar. At this critical moment, the expedition gained one of its most important figures, Sacagawea. Sacagawea entered the story not as an explorer by choice, but through circumstance. A young Shoshone woman, she had been taken from her people years earlier and eventually married to Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian trader. When Lewis and Clark encountered Charbonneau's camp, they recognized immediately what Sacagawea represented, a bridge. She spoke Shoshone and Hidatsa, understood the land, and, just as importantly, carried cultural authority the Corps lacked. Her presence transformed how the expedition was perceived. A military unit could provoke suspicion. A group travelling with a woman and her infant son signalled something different. War parties did not bring families. This single detail likely saved the Corps from countless hostile encounters. Where weapons created tension, Sacagawea created hesitation, curiosity, and space for negotiation. Her contributions went far beyond symbolism. She identified edible plants when supplies ran low. She recognized landmarks remembered from childhood, offering crucial geographic insight. When a boat nearly capsized, it was Sacagawea who calmly retrieved journals and instruments, preserving the records Jefferson had demanded. Survival often hinged on such moments, quiet and easily overlooked. Yet Sacagawea's role has often been romanticized or simplified. She was not a silent guide pointing westward in legend. She was a young woman navigating pregnancy, motherhood, and trauma while travelling through territory shaped by loss and displacement. Her strength lay not in heroics, but in endurance. She adapted constantly, balancing her own vulnerability with the expedition's needs. For Lewis and Clark, Sacagawea embodied the reality of the land they were crossing. The West was not empty. It was lived in, remembered, and claimed by others long before Americans arrived. Her presence forced the expedition to confront this truth daily. As the Corps moved closer to the mountains, Sacagawea became more than a guide. She became a living reminder that survival in the unknown depended not on domination, but on understanding, restraint, and respect for those who already knew the land. By the time the Missouri River began to narrow and strain against rising ground, the expedition understood a hard truth. Water alone would not carry them to the Pacific. Ahead loomed the Rocky Mountains, a barrier far more imposing than anything Meriwether Lewis and William Clark had imagined. From the east, the land had risen gradually. From the west, it would drop violently. Between them stood snow, altitude, and uncertainty. Crossing the mountains required horses, not boats. This forced the expedition into a delicate dependency on native diplomacy. Without animals, the mission would end where the river did. Here, Sacagawea became indispensable once again. As they approached Shoshone territory, she recognized familiar landscapes, and in a moment heavy with emotion, reunited with her own people. Through her, Lewis and Clark secured the horses they desperately needed. Even with horses, the Rockies were unforgiving. Trails were narrow, supplies dwindled, and winter pressed in early. Snow fell deep enough to swallow men and animals alike. Food ran scarce. The Corps was reduced to eating roots, candles, and whatever game could be caught in frozen terrain. Morale wavered as the reality of starvation crept closer. Leadership mattered more than ever. Lewis struggled under the weight of responsibility, while Clark's steady presence kept the men moving forward. Decisions were no longer theoretical. A wrong turn meant death. A delayed crossing meant freezing in place. The mountains did not care about Jefferson's ambitions or national destiny. Navigation here relied less on instruments and more on trust. Native guides led them across passes invisible to outsiders. Without this knowledge, the Corps would have been lost. The expedition was no longer charting land for future settlers. It was borrowing survival techniques from people who had lived there for generations. When they finally crossed the continental divide, there was no triumphant moment, no clear sign they had succeeded. Just exhaustion, thin air, and the grim understanding that the journey west was only half complete. The Rockies had not defeated them, but they had stripped the expedition down to its core. Beyond the mountains lay rivers flowing toward the Pacific, but the cost of reaching them had been hunger, humility, and the realization that the American West would never be conquered easily. Once the expedition cleared the Rockies, gravity finally worked in their favor. Rivers now flowed west, carrying the core away from the mountains that had nearly ended them. Canoes replaced horses, and for the first time in months, movement felt natural rather than forced. Yet relief was tempered by exhaustion. Hunger had hollowed the men. Boots were shredded. Spirits were fragile. The rivers themselves offered no mercy. The Clearwater, Snake, and Columbia cut through steep canyons and roared with rapids powerful enough to shatter boats. Navigation demanded constant vigilance. One misjudged current could scatter supplies or drown men beyond rescue. Several times canoes capsized, soaking precious equipment and nearly ending the mission outright. Encounters with native nations along the Columbia revealed a different world from the plains. Villages were larger, trade networks more complex, and societies deeply tied to the salmon runs that sustained them. The core relied heavily on local knowledge, learning how to preserve fish and navigate unfamiliar waters. These interactions were transactional, but cautious. News of Americans had travelled ahead of them, shaping expectations and suspicion. Disease followed the river. Illness weakened men already pushed beyond endurance, yet leadership held. Decisions were debated openly, discipline remained intact, and morale survived through shared hardship. Remarkably, the expedition still counted nearly all its members alive. In an era when exploration often meant mass death, this alone marked extraordinary success. When the smell of salt finally reached them, it came not with triumph, but with disbelief. After months of river and mountain, the Pacific Ocean emerged grey and endless. The long-sought destination existed. The western edge of the continent was real. Winter forced the expedition to halt. They built Fort Clatsop near the coast, enduring rain, sickness, and isolation. Food was monotonous. Clothing rotted in constant damp. Yet this pause allowed reflection. Journals were completed, maps refined, specimens catalogued. The mission's purpose shifted from survival back to documentation. Standing at the ocean did not feel like victory. It felt like completion, earned through suffering. The core had crossed a continent without losing its core. The journey west had proven that the land was vast, inhabited and unforgiving, but navigable with cooperation and resilience. The Pacific marked the end of exploration in one direction. Ahead lay the long return east, carrying knowledge that would reshape how the nation understood itself and the land it claimed to possess. Reaching the Pacific did not mean the expedition was finished. In many ways, the most dangerous phase still lay ahead. Winter had trapped the core on the coast, and when spring finally arrived, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark faced a sobering reality. They had to cross everything again, this time against time, weather, and fatigue. The return journey demanded new decisions. Familiar routes could not simply be reversed. Snow lingered in the mountains far longer than expected, forcing delays and difficult choices. Supplies were limited. The men were thinner, weaker, and worn down by 2 years of constant strain. Knowledge gained on the way west helped, but certainty remained elusive. Leadership evolved. Lewis and Clark split the core at points to explore additional territory, maximizing what they could bring back to Jefferson. This decision increased risk, but reflected confidence built through survival. The expedition was no longer improvising blindly. It was operating with hard-earned experience. Tension surfaced in subtle ways. Lewis, burdened by responsibility and prone to introspection, struggled with decision-making under pressure. Clark's steadiness again proved essential, balancing caution with momentum. Their partnership, forged through hardship, held firm when others might have fractured. Encounters with native nations on the return were shaped by memory. Some welcomed the corps back as familiar figures. Others remained wary, aware that Americans rarely passed through land without eventually returning in greater numbers. The expedition carried gifts, words of peace, and promises it could not guarantee would be honoured. One incident nearly ended everything. Lewis was accidentally shot during a hunting mishap, a reminder of how fragile survival remained even after success. He recovered slowly, pressing on despite pain and weakness. The mission could not stop. History would not wait for healing. As rivers widened and familiar landmarks reappeared, the sense of distance closed. What had once felt infinite now felt measured. The unknown had become known, mapped, and recorded. When the corps finally returned east, they did not arrive as conquerors or heroes in their own minds. They arrived as witnesses. They carried journals filled with observations, maps etched from memory, and stories of cooperation, suffering, and resilience. The journey home completed the expedition's purpose. The West was no longer imagined. It had been walked, crossed, and survived. When the Corps of Discovery returned east, they brought back more than survival stories. They carried knowledge that fundamentally altered how the United States understood its own future. The journals of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark transformed vague speculation into concrete reality. Rivers now had courses, mountains had passes. The West was no longer an idea. It was a place. Their records catalogued hundreds of plant and animal species previously unknown to American science. Some were practical discoveries, sources of food, medicine, or trade. Others were simply proof of the continent's biological richness. Jefferson's Enlightenment dream had succeeded. Observation and reason had survived the wilderness. Maps were perhaps the expedition's greatest legacy. Clark's cartography redrew the interior of North America with unprecedented accuracy. These maps would guide traders, soldiers, and settlers for decades. Routes once guessed at were now traced with confidence. The Mississippi was no longer the edge of American knowledge. It was merely the beginning. Yet the information carried consequences far beyond science. The expedition confirmed that westward expansion was possible. Difficult, dangerous, and costly, but possible. This realization accelerated migration, trade, and eventually conquest. What Lewis and Clark documented would soon be followed by roads, forts, and towns. Native nations understood this shift more clearly than most Americans. To them, the expedition was not a neutral act of discovery, but a signal. Knowledge is power, and maps are claims. Though Lewis and Clark often acted with respect, the future their success enabled would not always follow that example. Sacagawea's role within this legacy is especially revealing. She returned quietly to relative obscurity, her contributions long minimized or romanticized. Yet without her knowledge, language, and presence, the expedition's success would have been far less certain. She symbolized cooperation, but also the unequal way history distributes recognition. For Jefferson, the expedition validated his belief that a republic could expand through intelligence rather than brute force alone. For the nation, it sparked confidence bordering on inevitability. The West would be crossed, settled, and claimed. Lewis and Clark had not conquered the continent, but they had unlocked it, and once unlocked, it could never again be closed. The success of the expedition came with a price that was not immediately visible when Meriwether Lewis and William Clark returned as national heroes. In the short term, the journey was celebrated as a triumph of courage, science, and leadership. But the knowledge they delivered did not remain neutral for long. Once the land was mapped, it became reachable. And once it was reachable, it became contested. The expedition unintentionally set events in motion that no single individual could control. Traders followed the routes Lewis and Clark had traced. Then came soldiers, surveyors, and settlers. What had been recorded as geography soon became policy. Rivers turned into borders. Trails became migration corridors. The West began to fill with newcomers who carried little understanding of the people already living there. For native nations, the expedition marked a turning point. Lewis and Clark often approached tribes with diplomacy and restraint, but they also carried the authority of a government expanding rapidly. Promises of peace and coexistence could not survive the pressure of mass settlement. Treaties were broken. Land was seized. Cultures were displaced or destroyed. Even the expedition's leaders struggled with the consequences. Clark later became a government official overseeing native affairs, a role that placed him at the centre of forced relocations he may not have fully anticipated during the journey. Lewis, haunted by responsibility and plagued by personal struggles, died only a few years after returning, his end marked by isolation rather than triumph. Sacagawea's fate mirrored this imbalance. Though essential to the mission's survival, she gained little lasting reward. Her image would later be transformed into a symbol of national unity, often stripped of the complexity and hardship she endured. The West celebrated her presence while overlooking the cost paid by her people. The expedition proved that exploration is never just about discovery. It is about what follows. Knowledge reshapes power, and power reshapes lives. Lewis and Clark opened a door that could not be closed, even if some later wished it could be. Their journey stands as both achievement and warning. It demonstrated what cooperation, planning, and endurance could accomplish, but it also showed how quickly curiosity can become conquest. The core of Discovery did not intend to transform the continent forever, yet by revealing it, they made transformation inevitable. More than 2 centuries after the core of Discovery returned east, the Lewis and Clark expedition continues to echo through American history. It endures not because it was flawless, but because it captured a moment when possibility, ambition, and uncertainty collided. The journey from the Mississippi to the Pacific reshaped how a nation imagined itself and its future. For the United States, the expedition became a foundational myth. It embodied exploration driven by curiosity rather than conquest, knowledge rather than pure force. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark were remembered as symbols of courage, teamwork, and endurance. Their journals turned wilderness into narrative, allowing Americans who would never travel west to imagine it vividly. Yet the expedition's true legacy is more complex. It stands at the beginning of a long chain of events that defined the 19th century. Westward expansion, settlement, and conflict all trace part of their origin to the knowledge Lewis and Clark recorded. What began as mapping and diplomacy evolved into migration, displacement, and empire. The story of Sacagawea remains central to how the expedition is remembered today. She has become a symbol of survival and guidance, often celebrated in monuments and currency. Yet her real legacy lies not in symbolism, but in reality. She represented the indispensable role of indigenous knowledge in American exploration, a truth long minimized or ignored. The expedition also reshaped how Americans understood nature. It revealed a continent of immense scale, ecological diversity, and difficulty. Rivers did not always lead where expected. Mountains resisted easy crossing. Survival depended on cooperation, adaptability, and humility. These lessons, though learned, were often forgotten in the rush that followed. Lewis and Clark themselves did not profit greatly from their achievement. Fame did not shield Lewis from inner turmoil, nor did it spare Clark from moral compromise as the nation expanded. Their lives after the journey remind us that history's turning points rarely bring peace to those who live through them. Ultimately, the Lewis and Clark expedition was not just a path across land. It was a threshold moment. It marked the point where the American imagination turned decisively westward. And once that turn was made, there was no going back. Before clothing became a marker of beauty, power, or identity, it served one simple purpose: keeping the human body alive. The earliest garments were not designed to impress or differentiate. They were improvised solutions to heat, cold, wind, sun, and injury. Long before weaving looms or dyes, humans wrapped themselves in animal skins, bark fibres, grasses, and hides, stitched together with bone needles and sinew. What you wore depended entirely on where you lived, and what the land allowed you to take from it. In cold climates, clothing meant insulation. Thick hides, layered furs, and tightly wrapped garments trapped heat and blocked wind. In hotter regions, clothing took the opposite approach. Loose coverings shaded the skin while allowing air to circulate, preventing overheating and sun damage. The difference between survival and death often came down to how well fabric worked with the climate rather than against it. At this stage, clothing was deeply practical and largely uniform. There was little distinction between what men, women, or children wore beyond size and immediate function. A garment's value was measured by durability and comfort, not appearance. Tiers were patched, hides reused, and garments adapted endlessly. Waste was not an option. As human groups began to settle rather than migrate constantly, clothing slowly changed. Predictable seasons encouraged experimentation. Plant fibers like flax and hemp were twisted into thread. Simple weaving emerged. These developments allowed lighter, more flexible garments that could be repaired and reproduced with greater ease than animal skins alone. Even then, clothing remained closely tied to survival. A poorly made garment meant exposure. A badly chosen material meant sickness. Early people understood this intuitively. Clothing was part of the same knowledge system as shelter, fire, and food storage. It was not separate from daily life. It was daily life. Only once survival was reasonably secure did clothing begin to accumulate meaning beyond function. Decoration, variation, and symbolism emerged slowly, layered on top of practical designs that already worked. Before fabric expressed identity, it expressed adaptation. In this sense, ancient clothing tells a story of intelligence rather than style. Every fold, wrap, and stitch reflects thousands of years of environmental learning. Long before fashion existed, humans were already engineers of fabric, shaping materials to match the demands of the world around them. As human societies grew more complex, clothing began to reflect not only survival, but landscape and labour. Nowhere is this clearer than in ancient Egypt, where heat, sun, and the annual rhythm of the Nile shaped how people dressed for thousands of years. Here, fabric was not chosen for warmth, but for breathability, lightness, and cleanliness. Linen became the defining material of Egyptian clothing. Made from flax grown along the Nile's fertile banks, linen was cool against the skin and ideal for a hot, dry climate. Its pale colour reflected sunlight rather than absorbing it, helping the body regulate temperature. Unlike wool or animal hides, linen could be washed easily, an important feature in a culture that valued ritual purity and hygiene. Early Egyptian clothing was strikingly simple in form. Men often wore short linen kilts tied at the waist, while women wore long, close-fitting dresses supported by straps. These garments were not tailored in the modern sense. They were wrapped, folded, and tied, allowing flexibility and reuse. The human body remained visible in outline, emphasizing movement rather than concealment. Status entered clothing not through shape, but through quality. Finer linen required more labour to produce and signalled wealth and rank. The elite wore sheer, carefully woven cloth, while labourers wore coarser versions suited for physical work. Clothing did not hide social hierarchy. It quietly displayed it. Religion also shaped fabric choices. Priests were required to wear linen, as animal products were associated with impurity in sacred contexts. This rule reinforced linen's prestige and tied clothing directly to cosmology. What you wore reflected not only your place in society, but your relationship to the divine. Jewellery, wigs, and accessories added complexity without changing the core garments themselves. Egyptians layered meaning onto simplicity. The clothing remained functional, but adornment allowed individuality, ceremony, and expression. What stands out most is restraint. Egyptian clothing changed little over centuries because it worked. Climate, material, and cultural values aligned so effectively that innovation was unnecessary. Fashion, in the modern sense, had no urgency here. In ancient Egypt, clothing was a quiet agreement between environment and civilization. Linen was not a trend. It was a solution perfected over generations, proving that sometimes evolution means knowing when not to change at all. Moving north into the Mediterranean world, Climate and culture reshaped ancient clothing once again. In ancient Greece, fabric became a medium not just for comfort, but for philosophy. Greek clothing reflected balance, proportion, and an idealized view of the human form, values that echoed throughout art, architecture, and daily life. Wool dominated Greek wardrobes,